Imagine this. You're a successful millionaire, living a life of luxury, when one day you cross paths with someone you never expected to see again, your childhood love. But she's not the person you remember. She's homeless, living on the streets, struggling just to survive. The shock hits you hard, but what you decide to do next is what will truly define your character. In this story, one man's unexpected gesture will leave you questioning everything you know about love, compassion, and second. It was a crisp autumn morning when Andrew Montgomery, a man whose wealth and status were known throughout the city, decided to take a detour from his usual route to the office. His life was meticulously planned. Meetings, business deals, charity events, all part of the polished image of a self-made millionaire. But today, something stirred inside him, a quiet unease that made him want to break from the monotony, if only for a few minutes. Little did he know that this small decision would change the course of his life forever. Andrew's car glided through the city streets, the tinted windows shielding him from the hustle and bustle of everyday life outside. He was no stranger to the darker side of the city. He had spent much of his youth in these very streets, scraping by and dreaming of a better future. But he had left all that behind. Now his name was synonymous with success, his face plastered on the covers of business magazines. Yet there were moments, rare as they were, when he would feel a pang of nostalgia for the simpler days when life was about more than just deals and wealth. As the car approached a familiar intersection, Andrew's eyes drifted toward the sidewalk. His heart skipped a beat as he caught sight of a woman sitting alone, wrapped in layers of worn-out clothing. Her head was bowed, her face obscured by unkempt hair, and in front of her was a small sign that read, "Anything helps." It was a sight Andrew had seen countless times before, but this time something was different. Something about her felt familiar, though he couldn't place it at first. He asked his driver to stop the car, his curiosity piqued. There was a tug at his memory, a faint whisper of recognition that he couldn't ignore. Stepping out of the sleek black vehicle, Andrew approached the woman cautiously, unsure of what he was hoping to find. As he got closer, the details of her face became clearer, and then it hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just any woman. "Emily?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman slowly lifted her head, her eyes dull and weary, as if she hadn't seen kindness in a long time. Her face was gaunt, her cheeks hollow, but beneath the layers of hardship and years lived on the streets. Andrew saw her, the girl he had once known, the girl he had loved. Now, before we continue with the rest of this incredible story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you don't want to miss out. Here, you'll find the best stories on YouTube, stories full of twists, emotions, and surprises that you won't get anywhere else. So hit that subscribe button right now, because the next part is going to blow your mind. Emily Sullivan had been everything to Andrew when they were young. They had grown up together in a small town, inseparable since childhood. She had been his first love, the person who had understood him in a way no one else ever had. They had shared dreams of a better life, plans of leaving their small town and making something of themselves. But life, as it often does, had other plans. After high school, circumstances had pulled them apart. Andrew had left to pursue his ambitions in the big city, while Emily had stayed behind, taking care of her ailing mother. They had promised to keep in touch, to never forget each other, but as the years passed, the distance between them grew. Eventually, they lost contact altogether. Andrew had moved on, or at least he thought he had. He had built his empire, made his millions, and created a life that most people could only dream of. But in all his success, he had never forgotten Emily. She was the one person who had seen him for who he really was, Before the wealth and the status, she had seen his heart. And now, here she was, sitting on the sidewalk, homeless, her once bright eyes clouded with the weight of the world. "Emily, is it really you?" Andrew asked, his voice trembling with disbelief. Emily blinked, her gaze unfocused at first. It was as if she were trying to place him, struggling to remember a face from a time long forgotten. And then, slowly, recognition dawned on her. Her eyes widened and her lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She was too shocked to speak. Andrew knelt down beside her, ignoring the stares of passers-by, and gently touched her arm. "It's me. It's Andrew." For a moment they just stared at each other, the years of separation hanging heavily between them. Andrew could hardly believe what he was seeing. The Emily he remembered was full of life, vibrant and carefree, always quick to laugh and dream of the future. The woman in front of him now looked like a ghost of that girl, someone who had been broken by life in ways he couldn't even begin to imagine. How did this happen?" he asked softly, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry from too many days spent in the cold. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper. "It's a long story." Andrew felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to ask her so many questions, to know everything that had happened to her since they had last seen each other. But he knew now wasn't the time. What mattered most in that moment was getting her out of this situation, getting her help. "Come with me," Andrew said gently, standing up and extending his hand to her. "Let me help you." Emily hesitated, her gaze flicking between Andrew and the ground. She had spent so long on her own, relying on no one but herself. The idea of accepting help, even from someone she once loved, felt foreign to her. But as she looked into Andrew's eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Kindness. Genuine, unfiltered kindness. With trembling hands, she reached out and took his hand. Andrew helped her to her feet, his heart aching at how frail she felt in his grip. He guided her to the car, his mind racing with thoughts of what to do next. He didn't have a plan, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let her slip away again. As the car pulled away from the curb, Andrew glanced over at Emily, who sat silently beside him, staring out the window. Her face was blank, but her hands were clenched tightly in her lap, betraying the tension she was feeling. Andrew wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything would be okay, but he knew that words wouldn't be enough. She had been through too much. What she needed now wasn't empty promises. She needed action. The drive to Andrew's penthouse was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Andrew's mind kept drifting back to the past, to the memories of their childhood together. He remembered the summer days they spent by the river, talking about their dreams and plans for the future. He remembered the nights they would sneak out to look at the stars, sharing their hopes and fears with each other. Emily had always been his anchor, the one person who kept him grounded when everything else seemed uncertain. But now, as he looked at her, he realized how much had changed. The Emily sitting next to him wasn't the same girl he had known all those years ago. Life had changed her, hardened her in ways he couldn't fully understand. And as much as he wanted to help her, he knew that he couldn't just swoop in and fix everything. This wasn't a fairy tale, and he wasn't a knight in shining armor. But he could try. He could be there for her in the way that she had once been there for him. When they arrived at the penthouse, Andrew led Emily inside, the luxurious surroundings a stark contrast to the world she had been living in. She looked around the spacious living room, her eyes wide with disbelief. It was clear that she hadn't been in a place like this in a long time, if ever. "Make yourself at home," Andrew said, his voice gentle. "You can stay here as long as you need. We'll figure everything out, I promise." Emily didn't say anything. She just stood there, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to protect herself from the overwhelming reality of the situation. Andrew wanted to do more, to say something that would make her feel safe, but he knew that it would take time for her to trust him again. After all, they were practically strangers now, despite their shared history. "I'll get you something to eat," Andrew said, heading toward the kitchen. "And some clothes, too. You don't have to worry about anything." As he busied himself in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal, his mind raced with thoughts of what the next steps would be. He knew that Emily needed more than just food and shelter. She needed help, real help. He thought about calling a doctor, a therapist, anyone who could provide the kind of support she would need to start rebuilding her life. But before any of that, she needed to feel safe. When Andrew returned to the living room with a tray of food, he found Emily sitting on the edge of the couch, her shoulders slumped, her gaze distant. She looked so small, so fragile, and it broke his heart to see her like this. "Here," he said softly, setting the tray down in front of her. "Eat something. You'll feel better." Emily looked at the food, then back at Andrew. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear, as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. Slowly, she reached for a piece of bread, her hands trembling slightly as she took a bite. For the first time since they had reconnected, Emily spoke more than a few words. "Why are you doing this, Andrew?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "Why now, after all these years?" Andrew sat down beside her, his heart heavy with emotion. He had asked himself the same question a dozen times since finding her on the street. Why now? Why had fate brought them back together at this exact moment? "I don't know," he admitted, his voice soft. "Maybe it's because I never stopped caring about you. Maybe it's because I feel like I owe you something. I don't know, Emily. But what I do know is that I'm not going to leave you out there. Not again." Emily looked down at her hands, her expression unreadable. "I don't know if I deserve this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Andrew reached out and gently took her hand in his grip firm but comforting. "You deserve better than what life has given you, and I'm going to help you get there." The days that followed were a delicate balancing act. Emily had accepted Andrew's help, but it was clear that her pride and the scars left by her years on the streets made it difficult for her to fully embrace the new life being offered to her. She spent most of her time quietly, keeping to herself, and while Andrew gave her space, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more beneath the surface, something she wasn't ready to reveal just yet. Andrew's heart ached as he watched Emily struggle with the most basic tasks. Something as simple as taking a shower or eating a proper meal seemed foreign to her now. He knew that the woman he once loved had been through hell, and he wanted nothing more than to help her heal. But how do you help someone when they don't believe they're worth saving? One evening, Andrew sat at the dining table reviewing some business documents when Emily emerged from the guest room. She had showered, and her hair was clean and combed, though still damp. She wore the clothes Andrew had bought for her, simple but comfortable. There was a slight hesitation in her step as she walked toward him, her eyes scanning the room nervously, as if she still didn't quite believe that this was her life now. Andrew looked up from his papers, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Hey, Emily, how are you feeling?" She shrugged slightly, sitting down across from him. "Better, I guess. It's just strange, all of this." "I know," Andrew replied gently. "It's a lot to take in, but you don't have to rush. Take things at your own pace." Emily nodded but didn't say anything for a while. Her gaze drifted around the room, taking in the luxury that surrounded her, luxury that felt so far removed from the life she had been living for years. She sighed quietly, her hands resting in her lap, fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. "I'm not sure I belong here," she said softly, almost to herself. Andrew's smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. "What do you mean?" Emily looked up at him, her expression conflicted. "This place. It's so different from what I'm used to now. I've been on the streets for so long, I don't even know how to live like this anymore. It feels wrong." Andrew set his papers aside and leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "You belong here, Emily. You deserve to be safe, to have a roof over your head and people who care about you. I know it's hard to accept right now, but you don't have to live like that anymore. Not as long as I'm around." Emily's eyes filled with uncertainty, and for a moment Andrew thought she might break down. But she didn't. Instead, she swallowed hard and nodded, though it was clear that the weight of her past still hung heavily over her. "You don't know everything I've been through," Emily said after a long pause. "You don't know the things I've done, just to survive." Andrew's heart tightened at her words, but he remained calm. He knew this was a pivotal moment, a chance for Emily to begin opening up about her past. He didn't push her, though. He wanted her to feel safe enough to share when she was ready. "You can tell me when you're ready," Andrew said softly. "No rush. Just know that I'm here for you." Emily nodded again, her gaze dropping to the table. She seemed lost in thought, her mind likely replaying memories she had long tried to forget. After a few moments of silence, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't always homeless," she began, her eyes distant. "After my mom passed away, I tried to keep it together. I worked 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to pay the bills, but it was never enough. The debt kept piling up, and eventually, I couldn't do it anymore. I lost the house, lost everything." Andrew listened intently, his heart breaking with every word she said. "I moved to the city thinking I could start over," Emily continued, "but things didn't go the way I planned. I couldn't find steady work, and the little money I had ran out fast. I ended up on the streets, and once you're out there, it's like the world forgets you exist. You become invisible." Her words hung in the air like a heavy cloud, and Andrew could feel the pain and shame radiating from her. He wanted to reach across the table to hold her hand, to comfort her in some way, but he knew that wasn't what she needed right now. What she needed was someone to listen, to hear her story without judgment. "I did things I'm not proud of," Emily admitted, her voice trembling slightly. "Things I never thought I'd have to do. But when you're starving, when you're desperate, you'll do whatever it takes to survive." Andrew clenched his fists under the table, trying to contain the anger he felt, not at Emily, but at the world that had pushed her to such a point of desperation. He couldn't imagine the horrors she had endured, the choices she had been forced to make. "Emily," he began, but she shook her head, cutting him off. "I don't need pity, Andrew," she said, her voice firmer now. "I've had enough of that. What I need is to figure out what comes next. How do I move forward from here?" Andrew nodded, understanding that she wasn't looking for sympathy. She was looking for a way to rebuild her life, to find some sense of purpose again. He admired her strength, even in the face of such overwhelming adversity. "We'll figure it out together," Andrew said, his voice steady. "You're not alone in this, Emily. Whatever you need, I'm here to help." Emily looked at him for a long moment, as if weighing his words, trying to decide if she could trust him. Finally she nodded, though the uncertainty in her eyes remained. "Okay," she said quietly, "but I need to do this on my own terms." Andrew smiled, relieved that she was willing to accept his help, even if it was on her own terms. "Of course, whatever you need." Over the next few weeks, Emily slowly began to adjust to her new life. It wasn't easy. There were moments when she felt like an outsider in Andrew's world of luxury and privilege. But Andrew never rushed her, never pressured her to be anything other than what she was. He gave her space to breathe, to heal, to figure out who she was now after everything she had been through. One afternoon, while Andrew was at a business meeting, Emily decided to take a walk through the city. She hadn't ventured out much since moving into Andrew's penthouse, but today she felt the need to reconnect with the world outside. As she walked down the busy streets, she passed by places that had once been familiar to her: the park where she used to sleep, the shelter that had turned her away when it was full, the corner where she had begged for spare change. It was strange, walking through these streets now, knowing that she no longer belonged to that world. But at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that a part of her would always be tied to it. She had spent years surviving on the streets, and those experiences had shaped her in ways that she couldn't simply erase. As she wandered through the city, lost in thought, she found herself standing in front of a small cafe. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the air, and for a moment she hesitated. It had been so long since she had allowed herself to enjoy something as simple as a cup of coffee. She had always saved whatever money she could scrounge up for food, shelter, or the occasional bus fare. But today she felt different. Today she wanted to treat herself to something small, something normal. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, the warmth of the cafe enveloping her like a comforting embrace. She ordered a cup of coffee and sat down by the window, watching the world go by outside. As she sipped her drink, Emily's mind drifted back to her conversation with Andrew. He had been so kind to her, so patient, and she couldn't help but wonder why. What had driven him to help her after all these years? Was it guilt for abandoning her? Or was it something more? Emily sighed, her fingers tracing the rim of the coffee cup. She wasn't sure what to make of her feelings toward Andrew. Part of her was grateful for his generosity, but another part of her felt conflicted. She had spent so long relying on herself, so long believing that she didn't need anyone. Letting Andrew into her life again, letting him help her, felt like opening a door she wasn't sure she was ready to walk through. But as much as she tried to deny it, Emily knew that a part of her still cared for Andrew. He had been her first love, the person who had seen her at her best, before life had torn them apart. And now he was seeing her at her worst, yet he still stood by her side. That kind of loyalty, that kind of compassion, was something she hadn't experienced in years. As Emily finished her coffee and prepared to leave the cafe, she made a decision. She wasn't ready to let Andrew all the way in just yet, but she was willing to try. She was willing to take the first step toward rebuilding not just her life, but her relationship with him. When she returned to the penthouse that evening, Andrew was waiting for her in the living room, a smile spreading across his face as she walked in. "How was your walk?" he asked, his tone light and casual. Emily smiled, feeling a warmth in her chest that she hadn't felt in a long time. "It was nice. I did some thinking." Andrew raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh? About what?" Emily hesitated for a moment before speaking. "About us. About everything that's happened." Andrew's expression softened, and he leaned forward, giving her his full attention. "What did you come up with?" Emily took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. I think I want to try. I don't know where this is going, and I'm still figuring things out, but I want to try. I want to see where this leads." Andrew's smile widened, a look of relief washing over him. "I want that too, Emily. We can take things slow as you need." Emily nodded, feeling a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. As the days turned into weeks, the delicate bond between Andrew and Emily continued to evolve. They found themselves talking more, opening up about their pasts and sharing memories of their childhood. It was as though they were slowly rediscovering who they had once been to each other and who they were becoming now. But despite this growing closeness, there was always an unspoken tension beneath the surface, an uncertainty about what the future held for them. Emily's struggles with her identity were far from over. While Andrew's world offered her safety and comfort, it also made her feel like she didn't quite belong. She had spent too long surviving in the harsh realities of the streets, and the gap between that life and the one she was living now felt too wide to bridge. It was a conflict that gnawed at her constantly. Could she ever truly leave behind the person she had become and embrace this new version of herself? One morning, Andrew decided to bring up a topic that had been weighing on his mind for a while. He found Emily sitting on the balcony, her eyes gazing out over the city. She had been spending more and more time in quiet reflection, and he knew that something was on her mind. He sat down beside her, the cool breeze of the early morning brushing against their faces. "You've been quiet lately," Andrew said softly, breaking the silence. Emily sighed, wrapping her arms around herself as if shielding herself from more than just the wind. "I've just been thinking." "About what?" She hesitated before answering, her voice low and uncertain. "About where I fit in all of this. In your world, I mean." Andrew frowned, not sure what she meant. "What do you mean? You fit here, Emily. You belong here." Emily shook her head, her gaze still fixed on the skyline. "That's the thing, Andrew. I don't know if I do. Your life is so different from mine. You've built this whole empire, and you've moved on from the past. But I'm still stuck there, in that part of my life that I can't seem to let go of." Andrew's heart ached at her words. He had always known that Emily was struggling with her transition back into a normal life, but hearing her express it so plainly made the reality hit harder. He reached out and gently took her hand, hoping to offer some comfort. "Emily, you don't have to leave that part of you behind," Andrew said, his voice soft but firm. "You've been through a lot, and those experiences are a part of who you are, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve to move forward." Emily looked down at their intertwined hands, her expression conflicted. "I don't know if I even know how to move forward. I've spent so long just trying to survive. I don't know how to live." Andrew's heart clenched at her words, but he remained calm. "We can figure it out together," he said gently. "You don't have to do this alone." Emily finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "I appreciate everything you've done for me, Andrew. Really I do. But sometimes I wonder, are you helping me because you feel guilty about leaving me behind all those years ago? Or is it because you actually care about me now?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy and unresolved. Andrew hadn't expected her to ask this, but he understood why she did. It was a question he had asked himself more than once, since the day he had found her on the streets. "I'm helping you because I care about you, Emily," he said honestly, his voice steady. "I cared about you back then, and I still care about you now. It's not about guilt. It's about wanting to be there for someone who means a lot to me." Emily's expression softened, but there was still a hint of doubt in her eyes. "I want to believe that," she said quietly, "but I'm not sure if I'm ready to let myself trust that again." Andrew nodded, understanding her hesitation. Trust was something that had been stripped away from her over the years, and he knew it would take time for her to rebuild it. He wasn't going to push her, but he wanted her to know that he was willing to wait. "You don't have to trust me right now," Andrew said, "but I'll be here when you're ready." Emily gave him a small, tentative smile, though the uncertainty in her heart remained. She wanted to believe that Andrew's intentions were pure, but the years of abandonment and hardship had made it difficult for her to let go of the walls she had built around herself. She wasn't sure if she could ever fully let those walls down again. A few days later, Andrew received a phone call that would change everything. It was from a friend of his who worked at a major news outlet. Apparently, someone had seen Andrew with Emily, one of the city's most prominent millionaires, helping a homeless woman, and now rumors were starting to swirl in the media. People wanted to know who Emily was, how she had come into Andrew's life, and whether there was more to their relationship than met the eye. Andrew felt a wave of frustration and protectiveness wash over him. He had tried to keep his personal life private, especially when it came to Emily. She had already been through enough without the added pressure of public scrutiny. The last thing she needed was for her past to be dragged through the tabloids. He hung up the phone, his mind racing. He had to tell Emily before the story broke, but he knew that it would devastate her. She had worked so hard to rebuild her life, and now it was all at risk of being exposed in the worst possible way. When Andrew found Emily later that afternoon, she was sitting on the couch, reading a book. She looked up as he entered the room, her expression softening into a smile. But when she saw the look on his face, her smile faded. "What's wrong?" she asked, setting the book down. Andrew sat down beside her, his heart heavy with the news he had to share. "Emily, something's happened." Her brow furrowed in concern. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "There's a story that's about to come out in the news. Someone saw us together, and now they're trying to dig into your past." Emily's face paled, her eyes widening in shock. "What? Why? Why would anyone care about me?" Andrew reached out and took her hand, his voice filled with regret. "Because of me. People want to know everything about my life. And now that you're part of it, they're trying to find out who you are." Emily's hand trembled in his, and Andrew could see the fear in her eyes. She had worked so hard to keep her past hidden, to protect herself from the judgment of the world, and now it was all at risk of being exposed. I can't go through this," Emily whispered, her voice shaky. "I've already lost so much. I can't lose what little I have left." Andrew's heart broke at her words. He wished he could shield her from the world, from the cruelty of the media, but he knew that wasn't possible. All he could do now was stand by her side and help her face whatever came next. "You won't lose anything," Andrew said firmly. "I'll make sure of that. We'll get through this together." But Emily wasn't so sure. The memories of her past came flooding back, the shame, the guilt, the fear of being exposed for who she had become. She had spent years hiding from the world, and now it felt like the walls she had built around herself were crumbling. "I don't know if I can do this," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. Andrew squeezed her hand, his voice gentle but determined. "You're stronger than you think, Emily. You've already been through so much, and you've survived. You can get through this too." But Emily wasn't convinced. The fear of the world finding out about her past, about the things she had done to survive, was overwhelming. She didn't want to be judged, to be pitied, or worse, to be seen as nothing more than the homeless woman who had been saved by a millionaire. She wanted to be more than that, but she wasn't sure if the world would ever let her be. As the hours passed, Emily's anxiety grew. She could feel the weight of the impending news story pressing down on her, suffocating her. She didn't want to face the world, to be exposed for all her flaws and failures. She had spent so long hiding, and now it felt like there was nowhere left to run. Finally, in the middle of the night, Emily made a decision. She couldn't stay here. She couldn't let herself be dragged into Andrew's world, into the media circus that was sure to follow. She needed to leave, to disappear before the story broke. She packed a small bag of her belongings, careful not to make too much noise as she moved through the penthouse. She knew that Andrew would try to stop her if he found out, but she couldn't let him. This was something she had to do on her own. As she reached the front door, her heart ached with the thought of leaving Andrew behind. He had been so kind to her, so patient. But she couldn't let him fight her battles for her. She had to face the world on her own terms, even if it meant disappearing again. With one last glance at the life she was leaving behind, Emily slipped out the door and into the night. Adunam. Essa parte da história marca o ponto de virada emocional e dramático, onde Emily é confrontada com a possibilidade de sua vida passada sendo exposta ao mundo. Sua decisão de fugir reflete seu medo de enfrentar a verdade e sua luta interna sobre quem ela é agora. A tensão está alta, preparando o cenário para o clímax e a resolução dos conflitos. The night air was cold as Emily stepped out into the quiet streets, her bag slung over her shoulder. Her heart pounded in her chest, the weight of her decision heavy on her mind. She had left without saying goodbye to Andrew, knowing that if he had seen her, he would have tried to stop her, and she wasn't ready for that conversation. Not yet. As she walked through the familiar streets, Emily's mind raced with thoughts of the past few weeks. It felt like a lifetime ago that Andrew had found her on the sidewalk, a broken shell of the woman she once was. He had given her a chance to rebuild, to start again, but now, as the threat of exposure loomed, Emily felt like she was slipping back into the life she had fought so hard to escape. The safety and comfort she had experienced with Andrew suddenly felt fragile, like it could be taken away at any moment. And maybe that was what scared her the most. She wandered for hours, her feet carrying her through the city's streets without any particular destination. The further she walked, the more her mind raced. She thought about Andrew, how patient and kind he had been with her, how he had never judged her for the things she had done or the life she had lived. But she also thought about the media, the headlines that were sure to come, the questions that would be asked. She didn't want to be pitied, and she certainly didn't want to be viewed as some tragic figure who had been rescued by a wealthy man. At some point in the night, Emily found herself sitting on a bench in a small park. The sky was beginning to lighten with the first signs of dawn, and the city was slowly coming to life around her. She watched as early morning joggers passed by, oblivious to her presence. For a moment, she felt invisible again, like she had felt for so many years while living on the streets. But this time, being invisible didn't feel like safety. It felt like defeat. As she sat there, the weight of her decision settled over her like a heavy blanket. She had run because she was scared, scared of being exposed, scared of being judged. But as she thought about it more, she realized that she wasn't just running from the media or the world. She was running from herself, from the version of herself that she had been trying so hard to leave behind. A part of her knew that she couldn't keep running forever. Andrew had offered her more than just a place to stay. He had offered her a chance to heal, to rebuild, and to rediscover who she was. And by leaving, she was throwing all of that away. Emily let out a deep sigh, her breath visible in the cold morning air. She had been running for so long, it was hard to imagine what it would feel like to stop. But maybe it was time. Maybe it was time to face the past and move forward, even if it meant confronting her fears. Meanwhile, back at the penthouse, Andrew woke up to find Emily gone. Panic surged through him as he searched the apartment, calling her name. But there was no response. Her bag was gone, and there was no note to explain where she had gone or why. His heart sank as he realized what had happened. She had left. For a moment, Andrew felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. He had tried so hard to help her, to show her that she didn't have to face the world alone. But now, she was out there on her own again, and he didn't know if she would ever come back. His first instinct was to go after her, to find her, and bring her back. But then he stopped himself. Emily had made the choice to leave, and as much as it hurt, he had to respect that. She wasn't ready to confront everything that was happening, and he couldn't force her to stay. All he could do now was wait and hope that she would find her way back to him. Andrew spent the rest of the day in a haze of worry and regret. He replayed their conversations over and over in his mind, wondering if there was something he could have said or done differently. He hated the thought of Emily being out there, alone and scared, but he also knew that she was strong. She had survived the streets before, and she could survive again, but that didn't make the ache in his chest any less painful. Hours passed, and as the sun began to set, Andrew's hope of seeing Emily again started to fade. He had left messages on her phone, called every contact he could think of, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had disappeared into the night, just like she had years ago. But then, just as he was about to give up hope, there was a knock on the door. Andrew's heart leapt as he rushed to answer it. He opened the door and there she was, Emily, standing in the hallway, her eyes tired but resolute. She looked different, like she had been through an internal battle and come out the other side stronger. "Emily," Andrew breathed, his voice filled with relief. "You're back." Emily nodded, her expression softening. "I'm sorry I left," she said quietly. I needed some time to think." Andrew stepped aside to let her in, his heart still racing from the rush of emotions. "You don't have to apologize," he said, his voice gentle. I was worried." Emily gave him a small smile as she stepped into the apartment, her bag still slung over her shoulder. "I know, and I appreciate that. But I needed to figure some things out on my own." Andrew closed the door behind her, watching as she set her bag down by the couch. "What did you figure out?" he asked, his voice tentative. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes meeting his. "I realize that I've been running for a long time, not just from the media or from the world, but from myself, from the person I used to be and the person I want to be, and I can't keep running, Andrew. Not anymore." Andrew felt a mixture of hope and relief wash over him. "So, what are you going to do?" Emily smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in her expression. "I'm going to stay, but I'm going to do it on my terms. I need to rebuild my life, not just as someone who's been through hard times, but as someone who's moving forward. And I want to do that with you." Andrew's heart swelled at her words, and he couldn't help but smile. "I want that too, Emily. I've wanted that for a long time." Emily stepped closer to him, her hand reaching out to touch his. "But I need you to understand something, Andrew. I'm not the same person I was all those years ago. I've been through things that have changed me, and I need time to heal. I can't just jump back into the life I had before. I need to find out who I am now." Andrew nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "I understand, and I'll give you all the time you need. I'm glad you're here." Emily smiled, a genuine smile this time, and for the first time in a long time, Andrew felt a sense of peace. She was here, and she was willing to try. That was all he could ask for. And the weeks that followed were filled with small steps forward for both Andrew and Emily. She began to slowly reintegrate into the world, finding ways to rediscover her sense of purpose. Andrew introduced her to some contacts in the non-profit world, where she could help others who had experienced homelessness. It was a cause that she cared deeply about, and for the first time in years, Emily felt like she was doing something that mattered. Her work with the non-profit organization became a crucial part of her healing process. She spent her days helping others, using her own experiences to guide and comfort those who were still struggling. It wasn't easy. There were days when the stories she heard brought back painful memories of her own time on the streets, but it also gave her a sense of purpose, a reason to get up in the morning. And slowly, she began to rebuild her confidence. Andrew, too, found himself changing as he watched Emily grow. He had always been focused on his business, on making deals and expanding his empire. But now he found himself more interested in the people around him, his employees, his clients, and even strangers he passed on the street. Emily had taught him that success wasn't just about wealth or power. It was about connection, about making a difference in the lives of others. Their relationship deepened as they both grew in their own ways. They spent more time together, not just as two people with a shared history, but as two individuals who had been through their own battles and come out stronger. There were still moments of uncertainty, times when Emily struggled with the remnants of her past, or when Andrew felt the weight of his responsibilities pressing down on him. But through it all, they supported each other. One evening, as they sat together on the couch, Andrew turned to Emily, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking," he said quietly. Emily looked at him, curious. "About what?" Andrew smiled softly. "About us. About the future." Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm. "What about it?" Andrew took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers. "I don't want to rush anything. I know we've both been through a lot, and I know we're still figuring things out. But I want you to know that I'm in this for the long haul. Whatever happens, wherever this goes, I'm not going anywhere." Emily felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. She hadn't been sure what to expect when she had returned to the penthouse that night, but hearing Andrew say those words made her realize that maybe, just maybe, she could trust him. "I'm not going anywhere either," Emily said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Andrew smiled, his heart swelling with hope and gratitude. "Good. Because I've waited a long time to get here." Emily laughed softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "So have I." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the past slowly lifting from their shoulders. There was still work to be done, still healing to be had, but for the first time in a long time, both of them felt like they were moving forward. And for now, that was enough. As the months passed, Emily's transformation was undeniable. She had taken the steps to rebuild her life, and in many ways she was a new person, stronger, more confident, and filled with a sense of purpose. Her work with the non-profit had not only given her a new sense of direction, but had also connected her to a community of people who shared her passion for helping others. She was no longer the woman who had been broken by the streets. She was becoming someone who could stand on her own again, even as she and Andrew grew closer. But with every step forward, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was still holding her back. There were parts of her past that she had never fully confronted. Painful memories, unresolved guilt, and lingering doubts that haunted her. She had come so far, yet there was still a part of her that felt undeserving of the life she was now living. The media frenzy had died down, and Andrew had managed to protect her privacy, but the shadows of her past lingered in the back of her mind. One evening, as they sat together in Andrew's penthouse, Emily felt a knot tighten in her chest. She had been thinking about this moment for days, knowing that it was time to have the conversation she had been avoiding. She looked over at Andrew, who was flipping through some documents, his face relaxed and focused. It was a quiet evening, the kind they had come to cherish, but Emily knew that peace would only last so long if she didn't confront what was weighing on her. "Andrew," she said softly, her voice breaking the silence. He looked up, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it?" Emily took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Andrew set the papers aside, his full attention now on her. "Okay, I'm listening." Emily's hands fidgeted in her lap, her heart racing as the words struggled to form. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind so many times, but now that it was here, she didn't know where to start. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she began to speak. When I was on the streets, there were things I had to do to survive, she said quietly, her voice trembling. Things I'm not proud of. I never wanted to tell you because I didn't want you to see me differently. But I can't keep hiding it anymore. Andrew's brow furrowed, his expression filled with concern. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his. Emily, whatever you did, it doesn't change how I feel about you. You did what you had to do to survive, and that doesn't make you any less deserving of the life you have now. Emily shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. I'm not talking about the things you already know. There's more. There's something I've been carrying with me for years, and I need to get it off my chest. Andrew squeezed her hand, his voice soft but firm. Whatever it is, you can tell me. I'm here for you. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. There was a man. I met him when I was at my lowest point. He offered me money in exchange for certain things. I was desperate, Andrew. I had nothing, and I agreed to it because I didn't see any other way. It was the only way I could survive. Her words hung in the air, heavy with shame and regret. Andrew's heart clenched at the pain in her voice. But he didn't flinch. He didn't pull away or show any signs of judgment. Instead, he leaned in closer, his hand still holding hers. I'm sorry you had to go through that, Andrew said quietly. But that doesn't change who you are, Emily. You're still the same person I care about. You're still strong, resilient, and deserving of love and respect. Emily's tears spilled over as she listened to his words. She had feared this moment for so long, convinced that once Andrew knew the truth, he would see her as someone broken, someone beyond saving. But instead, he was meeting her pain with compassion, and that was something she had never expected. I just didn't want you to think less of me, Emily whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't want you to see me as weak. Andrew shook his head, his voice filled with conviction. You're not weak, Emily. You're one of the strongest people I've ever known. You've been through things most people couldn't even imagine, and you're still here. You're still fighting. Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief. How can you still see me like that after everything I've told you? Because I know who you are, Andrew said softly. I know your heart, and I know that the choices you made don't define you. What defines you is how you've overcome those choices, how you've grown and rebuilt your life. That's what matters. Emily's heart swelled with emotion as she listened to his words. For so long, she had carried the burden of her past, convinced that it would always hold her back. But in this moment, with Andrew by her side, she felt the weight begin to lift. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive myself for the things I've done, Emily admitted, her voice quiet. But maybe I can start to heal. Andrew smiled, his hand gently brushing away her tears. You've already started, Emily, and I'll be with you every step of the way. In that moment, something shifted between them. The barriers that Emily had built around her heart began to crumble, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to fully trust someone again. It wasn't just about Andrew's words. It was about the way he had stood by her through everything, the way he had never once wavered in his support. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation slowly lifting as they held each other. Emily rested her head on Andrew's shoulder, her heart finally at peace after so many years of turmoil. She knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still challenges to face, still wounds to heal. But for the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone in the journey. In the days that followed, Emily's sense of peace only grew. She continued her work with the non-profit, pouring her heart into helping others who had been through similar experience. And with Andrew's support, she began to open up more about her past, both to him and to the people she was helping. It was a slow process, but each step forward felt like a victory, a small yet significant piece of her healing. But the real test came one afternoon when Emily was invited to speak at a fundraising event for the non-profit. It was an opportunity for her to share her story, to show the world that she was more than just a victim of circumstance. At first, she hesitated. The idea of standing in front of a crowd, exposing her vulnerabilities for all to see, terrified her. But with Andrew's encouragement and the support of the people she had come to trust, Emily decided to take the plunge. The day of the event arrived, and as Emily stood backstage, she felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. She had spoken to small groups before, but never to an audience this large. Her heart raced as she heard the sound of applause from the crowd, signaling the end of the previous speaker's presentation. It was almost her turn. Andrew stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "You've got this," he said softly, his voice steady and reassuring. "Just be yourself. They're going to love you." Emily smiled nervously, though his words did little to calm the storm of nerves raging inside her. "What if I mess up?" "You won't," Andrew said confidently. "You're stronger than you think, Emily. You've already been through the hardest parts. This is just another step forward." Emily took a deep breath, nodding as she tried to steady her thoughts. She knew that Andrew was right. She had already faced far greater challenges than this. But still, the fear of being judged, of being exposed, lingered in the back of her mind. When her name was called, Emily's heart skipped a beat. She walked out onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her as she stepped up to the podium. The room was filled with hundreds of faces, all looking up at her, waiting to hear her story. For a moment, Emily felt like she might freeze, her mind blanking under the pressure. But then she looked out into the audience and saw Andrew sitting in the front row, his eyes locked on hers. His expression was filled with pride and encouragement, and in that moment, Emily knew she wasn't alone. She took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edges of the podium as she began to speak. "My name is Emily Sullivan," she said, her voice shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word. "And for a long time, I was lost. I spent years living on the streets, doing whatever I could to survive. I've been through things that I never thought I would have to face, but today I'm standing here because I found my way back." The room was silent, the audience hanging on her every word. Emily felt her confidence grow as she continued, her voice steady and sure. "I'm not here to ask for pity," she said, her gaze sweeping across the room. "I'm here to show you that no matter how far you've fallen, no matter how broken you feel, there's always a way forward. There's always hope, and with the support of people who care, you can rebuild your life." The crowd remained silent for a moment, before erupting into applause. Emily felt a rush of emotion wash over her as the audience's support washed over her. She had done it. She had shared her story, not as a victim, but as someone who had overcome, someone who was still standing. As she stepped off the stage, Andrew was there to meet her, his eyes filled with pride. "You were incredible," he said, pulling her into a tight embrace. Emily smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I couldn't have done it without you." Andrew shook his head. "You did it, Emily. You've always had the strength inside you. I just helped you see it." Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her as they walked out of the event together. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was in control of her own life. She had faced her fears, confronted her past, and come out stronger. And with Andrew by her side, she knew that whatever the future held, she would be ready for it. As the applause from the audience began to fade and Emily stepped off the stage, she felt a profound sense of relief and accomplishment wash over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't running from her past, she was owning it. The weight that had sat so heavily on her shoulders for so long was finally starting to lift. She had shared her truth, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her story, her identity, and her future. Andrew walked beside her as they exited the event, his arm gently resting on the small of her back. The pride in his eyes was unmistakable, and though he hadn't said much since her speech, Emily could feel the silent support radiating from him. "I'm so proud of you," Andrew said softly as they stepped outside into the cool evening air. Emily turned to look at him, a small smile playing on her lips. "I couldn't have done it without you." Andrew shook his head, his expression serious. "No, Emily, you did this. You've always had that strength in you, even when you didn't see it. I just helped you find it." Emily's heart swelled at his words, a deep warmth spreading through her chest. She had spent so many years believing that she wasn't enough, that the things she had been through had diminished her value. But now, standing here with Andrew, she could finally see herself through his eyes, and it was like seeing a whole new version of herself. The months that followed were transformative, not just for Emily, but for both of them. Their relationship grew stronger, built on a foundation of trust, respect, and shared growth. They spent more time together, not just as two people bound by a complicated past, but as partners building a future. They had both changed. Andrew had become more compassionate, more aware of the world outside his corporate empire, and Emily had learned to embrace her strength and resilience. But as their bond deepened, so did the inevitable questions about their future. Emily had been so focused on rebuilding her life, on finding her sense of purpose, that she hadn't given much thought to what came next. Now that she had a firm foundation, she found herself wondering where her relationship with Andrew was headed. One evening, as they sat together in the quiet of Andrew's penthouse, Emily broached the subject that had been lingering in the back of her mind for weeks. "Andrew," she began hesitantly, her fingers tracing the edge of the glass of wine in her hand, "can we talk about us?" Andrew looked up from the book he had been reading, his brow furrowing slightly in concern. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Emily bit her lip, choosing her words carefully. "We've been through a lot together, and I care about you, more than I ever thought I could. But sometimes I wonder where we're headed, what our future looks like." Andrew set the book aside, leaning forward to give her his full attention. "I've been thinking about that too," he admitted, his voice soft. "And I want you to know that I'm in this for the long haul. Whatever happens, I want us to face it together." Emily nodded, though the uncertainty in her heart remained. "I want that too," she said quietly, "but I'm still figuring things out. I don't know if I'm ready to take the next step. Not yet." Andrew's expression softened with understanding. "That's okay. We don't have to rush anything. We've both been through a lot, and I'm willing to take things at whatever pace you need." Emily smiled, grateful for his patience and his willingness to meet her where she was. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Andrew reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "We'll figure it out together. I'm not going anywhere." As time went on, Emily continued to flourish in her work with the non-profit. Her role had expanded, and she was now leading several initiatives aimed at helping people transition out of homelessness. It was work that filled her with purpose and meaning, and every day she saw the impact of her efforts on the lives of those she helped. She had found a new sense of identity, one that wasn't tied to her past, but was instead rooted in the person she had become. Her relationship with Andrew also continued to grow, though they were careful not to rush things. They had learned from their past mistakes, both individually and as a couple, and they knew that the key to a successful future was communication and patience. They spent their days balancing their professional lives with their time together, building a relationship that was grounded in mutual respect and a deep emotional connection. But despite their progress, there were still moments of doubt. Moments when Emily questioned whether she could truly leave her past behind and build a future with Andrew. She had come so far, but the scars of her experiences still lingered, and there were times when she wondered if she was deserving of the happiness she had found. One night, as they sat together on the balcony of Andrew's penthouse, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, Emily voiced her fears. "Do you ever think about the future?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with emotion. "About what it will look like for us?" Andrew glanced over at her, his expression thoughtful. "I think about it all the time," he admitted. "But I don't have all the answers. All I know is that I want to spend it with you." Emily looked down at her hands, her heart heavy with the weight of her doubts. I don't know if I can ever fully let go of everything that's happened. What if I can't be the person you need me to be?" Andrew reached out, gently lifting her chin so that her eyes met his. "You don't have to be anything other than who you are, Emily. I love you for who you are, not for some version of yourself that you think you need to become." Emily's breath caught in her throat at his words, her heart swelling with emotion. She had never heard him say those words before, and now that he had, they felt both terrifying and exhilarating. You love me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Andrew smiled, his eyes filled with warmth and sincerity. "Of course I do. I've loved you for a long time, Emily. I've just been waiting for the right moment to tell you." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she processed his words. For so long she had believed that she was unworthy of love, that the things she had been through had made her too broken to be loved. But here was Andrew, the man who had stood by her side through everything, telling her that he loved her, just as she was. "I love you too," Emily said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. Andrew's smile widened as he pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "We'll figure this out together," he whispered against her hair. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." In that moment, Emily knew that she wasn't alone. For the first time in a long time, she felt truly loved, truly accepted. And with Andrew by her side, she knew that she could face whatever the future held. The following months brought a sense of peace and stability that Emily hadn't experienced in years. Her work continued to thrive, and her relationship with Andrew grew stronger every day. They had learned to navigate the challenges that came with their different worlds, and they had built a life together that was rooted in trust, love, and mutual support. But as they moved forward, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was still one final step she needed to take in her journey of healing. She had faced so many of her demons, but there was one person she had yet to confront: her estranged father. She hadn't spoken to him in years, not since he had abandoned her and her mother when she was a teenager. The pain of his betrayal had been one of the driving forces behind her downward spiral, and though she had tried to bury that part of her past, it still haunted her. She knew that if she was ever going to fully move forward, she needed to confront him, to make peace with the part of her life that had been defined by his absence. One afternoon, as she sat with Andrew on the balcony, she brought up the idea. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice hesitant. "There's something I need to do, something I've been avoiding for a long time." Andrew looked over at her, his expression filled with concern. "What is it?" Emily took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "I need to see my father. I need to confront him, to get closure. I've been carrying the pain of what he did for so long, and I don't think I can fully heal until I face him." Andrew's brow furrowed, his voice soft but supportive. "Are you sure you're ready for that?" Emily nodded, though the thought of seeing her father again filled her with both fear and resolve. I don't know if I'll ever be fully ready, but I know it's something I need to do." Andrew reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "I'll be with you every step of the way, Emily. You don't have to do this alone." Emily smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I know, and that's why I think I'm ready." A week later, Emily found herself standing outside her father's small, run-down apartment. The building was a far cry from the luxurious world she had become accustomed to, but it reminded her of where she had come from, of the life she had once lived. Her heart raced as she stood at the door, her hand hovering over the doorbell. She glanced over at Andrew, who stood beside her, offering silent support. He gave her a reassuring nod, and with a deep breath, Emily pressed the button. The door creaked open a few moments later, revealing a man who looked far older than Emily remembered. Her father's face was lined with wrinkles, his hair graying at the temples. His eyes widened in shock as he saw her standing there, and for a moment neither of them spoke. "Emily?" he finally whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Emily swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello, Dad." The door stood open, the air thick with the tension of unresolved history. Emily stood face to face with the man who had once been her father, though he looked like a stranger now. Time had not been kind to him. His eyes, once sharp and full of authority, were now dimmed by the weight of years and regret. Emily's heart raced, unsure of how to navigate this moment. For so long she had dreamed of confronting him, of demanding answers for his betrayal, but now that she was here, standing in front of him, she felt only a deep, aching sadness. "Emily," her father repeated, his voice trembling slightly. He opened the door wider, gesturing for her to come inside. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again." Emily hesitated for a moment, glancing back at Andrew, who gave her a small, reassuring nod. She took a deep breath and stepped inside, her father closing the door behind them. The apartment was small and dimly lit, cluttered with old furniture and boxes that hadn't been unpacked in years. It was a far cry from the luxurious world Emily had grown accustomed to with Andrew, but it felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain, like a ghost from a past life. They sat down at the small kitchen table, the silence between them heavy and uncomfortable. Emily's father fidgeted with his hands, his gaze flickering between her and the floor. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this moment for a long time, but wasn't sure how to begin. "I've thought about you every day," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know I hurt you. I know I wasn't there when you needed me." Emily swallowed hard, the old wounds of abandonment resurfacing. For years she had carried the pain of his absence, the anger at how easily he had left her and her mother behind. But now, sitting across from him, she realized that her anger had dulled over time. What remained was a hollow sadness, a longing for the closure she had never received. "Why did you leave us?" Emily asked, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Why did you just walk away?" Her father's face crumpled, his hands trembling as he struggled to find the words. "I was weak, Emily. I wasn't strong enough to be the father you needed. Your mother. She deserved better than me. You deserved better than me. I thought you'd be better off without me, and by the time I realized how wrong I was, it was too late." Emily's heart ached at his words, the vulnerability in his voice stirring something inside her. She had always imagined this moment as one of confrontation, of anger and accusations, but now that it was here, all she felt was sorrow, for the man who had failed her, for the family they could have been. "You were my father," she said quietly, her voice breaking. "I didn't need you to be perfect. I just needed you to be there." Her father's eyes filled with tears, his regret and guilt written plainly on his face. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. I'm so sorry, Emily." The room was silent for a long time, the weight of their shared pain hanging in the air. Emily felt a lump form in her throat, her emotions swirling inside her. She had spent so many years hating him, blaming him for everything that had gone wrong in her life. But now, looking at the broken man before her, she realized that holding on to that anger had done nothing but keep her trapped in the past. "I forgive you," Emily said softly, her words surprising even herself. Her father looked up at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. You do?" Emily nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I forgive you. Not because what you did was okay, but because I can't keep carrying this anger with me anymore. It's time for me to let go." Her father's shoulders sagged with relief, tears streaming down his face as he reached across the table and took her hand. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Emily." They sat in silence for a while, the tension between them slowly easing as the weight of years of unspoken words began to lift. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. There were still wounds that would take time to heal, and there was no undoing the past. But for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she had taken a step toward peace. But later that evening, as Emily and Andrew drove back to the penthouse, the city lights flickering outside the car window, Emily leaned her head against the seat and closed her eyes. She felt exhausted, emotionally drained from the confrontation with her father, but there was also a sense of closure that she hadn't anticipated. "How do you feel?" Andrew asked softly, glancing over at her. Emily opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. "Lighter," she admitted, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I didn't think I'd ever be able to forgive him, but now that I have, I feel like I can finally move on." Andrew reached over and gently took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I'm proud of you. That couldn't have been easy." Emily nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude for his unwavering support. "It wasn't. But I think it was something I needed to do. I've been carrying that pain for so long. It feels good to finally let it go." They drove the rest of the way in comfortable silence, the weight of the day slowly fading as they made their way back to the life they had built together. Emily knew that there would still be challenges ahead. Healing wasn't a linear process, and there were still parts of her past that she would need to confront in her own time. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was truly in control of her own story. In the months that followed, Emily's life continued to evolve. She became more involved in her work with the non-profit, eventually taking on a leadership role that allowed her to expand their reach and help even more people transition out of homelessness. Her personal journey had given her a unique perspective, and she used her experiences to connect with those who were still struggling, offering them hope and guidance as they rebuilt their own lives. They had learned to navigate the complexities of their different worlds, finding a balance that worked for both of them. Andrew's corporate life was demanding, but he always made time for Emily and her work, supporting her in every way he could. They had built a life together that was grounded in love, trust, and mutual respect. And though they still faced challenges, they knew they could face them together. One evening, as they sat together on the balcony, watching the sunset over the city, Andrew turned to Emily with a thoughtful expression on his face. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion, "about the future." Emily looked over at him, her heart skipping a beat. "What about it?" Andrew smiled softly, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small velvet box. "I think it's time we start building it together." Emily's breath caught in her throat as he opened the box to reveal a beautiful engagement ring, the diamond catching the last rays of the setting sun. Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at Andrew, her heart swelling with love and gratitude for the man who had stood by her through everything. "Emily," Andrew said softly, his voice filled with love. "I love you. I've loved you for a long time, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me?" Emily's heart raced as she looked into his eyes, her own emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She had never imagined that her life would lead her here, to this moment, with this man. But now that it had, she couldn't imagine anything else. "Yes," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks as she smiled. "Yes, I'll marry you." Andrew's face lit up with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger, pulling her into his arms and holding her close. They stood together on the balcony, the world around them fading away as they held each other, their future unfolding before them. The following months were filled with excitement and anticipation as Emily and Andrew began planning their wedding. It wasn't a grand affair. Both of them had agreed that they wanted something intimate, a celebration of their journey together, rather than a display of wealth or status. They invited only their closest friends and family, including the people Emily had met through her work with the non-profit. The day of the wedding arrived, and as Emily stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her simple but elegant dress, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. She had faced her demons, confronted her past, and found love and acceptance in a way she had never thought possible. And now she was about to start the next chapter of her life with the man she loved. Andrew stood at the end of the aisle, his eyes filled with emotion as he watched Emily walk toward him. Their love had been tested in ways that most couples couldn't imagine, but they had emerged stronger for it. As they exchanged their vows, promising to love and support each other through whatever life threw their way, Emily felt a sense of peace and joy that she had never known before. When the ceremony was over and they stood together as husband and wife, Emily looked out at the faces of the people who had supported them on their journey. Andrew's colleagues, her friends from the non-profit, and even her father, who had come to make amends. It was a moment of healing, not just for Emily, but for everyone who had been part of her story. As the evening came to a close and the guests began to leave, Emily and Andrew stood together under the stars, holding each other close. "We did it," Emily whispered, her voice filled with awe. Andrew smiled, his arms wrapped around her. "We did, and this is just the beginning." Emily looked up at him, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Andrew leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I should be thanking you. You've made me a better man, Emily, and I can't wait to spend the rest of my life with you." As they stood together, looking out at the world that lay ahead of them, Emily knew that they had overcome so much to get here. Their journey had been filled with challenges, pain, and heartache, but it had also been filled with love, growth, and healing. And now, as they faced the future together, Emily felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Before you go, don't miss out on more incredible stories. Click on the playlist that's popping up on your screen right now. It's packed with some of the best stories you'll ever find on YouTube. Trust me, these tales are even more thrilling, emotional, and surprising than the one you just watched. Go ahead and click. You won't want to miss what's next.